Never let her near the study, Julian had said, and he said it like a warning meant to keep a secret safe. 2 days later, he was gone in a way that allowed no argument, the kind of sudden absence that turned routines into relics. In the law office, a woman with a voice like dry paper slid a small wooden box across the desk. Inside lay a heavy brass key with an H stamped into the bow and a sealed envelope with Evelyn Carter written in a hand that had once signed stock certificates and vacation postcards alike. The key felt cold and strangely familiar in her palm. The envelope smelled faintly of tobacco and lemon oil. The lawyer said the words lawyers say with neutral faces, the way weather reporters mention storms. There were conditions attached to the will, precise and improbable. Julian had left a laptop for her with a password spelled out in a line of a letter and a single instruction that read like a dare. She pressed her thumb against the paper until the edge dug into her skin, and then she made a decision that shocked even herself. She would go to Mariner House today. She would turn the key he forbade her to use, and she would, if necessary, teach his rival's daughter how to tend to what he had left. There would be people at the edges of this promise who would try to take what he had hidden for them. She felt the ache of that thought like a small animal beneath the ribs and folded the envelope into her coat as if she could keep both grief and purpose from falling out. The trip to the coast took the better part of a day and stretched across weather like a film strip. Evelyn arrived at Mariner House during late afternoon when light lay long and forgiving over slate roofs. The ocean sounded distant and then louder as the avenue narrowed into pines. The gatekeeper yawned and smelled of engine oil and coffee. The gravel under the tires made a dry crunch. The air tasted of salt and cut grass. Mariner House sat against the bluff like an unfinished sentence. Its paint had been refreshed in haste, but the roofline sagged in a way only time can teach a house to do. She noticed the smell of old varnish in the foyer, the faint residue of lemon oil on the banister, the way the floorboards sang a thin note when she stepped. Marco, the estate manager, met her at the door with hands like planks and a face like a man who had learned to judge weather by how it looked when it arrived. He smelled of pipe tobacco and new leather. His voice was low and practical. He had been there the morning Julian came down with an idea and had stayed when others had not. He watched her open the envelope with his eyes narrow, and when she, Sarah Evelyn, he smiled, a private smile, and said nothing. There was a knock later and the sound of voices on the drive. Evelyn stepped outside and saw 3 cars clustered like a cabal at the end of the lane. Victor Hale arrived with a corporation smile that gleamed like chrome. He moved with the casual entitlement of a man who had spent decades persuading institutions to bend around his will. Beside him stood Isabella Hale in a gray coat, her hair cropped and the set of her jaw unfamiliar to Evelyn. Isabella smelled faintly of citrus and perfume, an odd mix of youth and something hard-earned. She was 26, and her hands were not small. Her eyes were quick and curious. That first evening, the house hummed with the sound of other people moving, of luggage being set down, and of law firms aligning themselves like chess pieces at the edges of conversation. Evelyn sat in the study with the brass key on her palm and the laptop open on the desk. The laptop screen light washed the room in a color like clean bone. The camera file names were simple, dated, pragmatic. Julian spoke in the first video with a voice that sometimes took on the softness of confession and sometimes the half-joke that had made him infamous in certain fast lunches. He said, "If you are watching this, then either I failed spectacularly or you are braver than I credited." There were 10 videos, each with a different morning, each with a line of instruction and a reason. He called Isabella by name with a mixture of amusement and challenge and said, "Teach her, Evelyn." The will said it in legalese, and the videos said it in grainy domestic light. The key opened a drawer in the desk, and under a false bottom, there were deeds and a map and a leather-bound book of accounts. The book smelled of dust and the stinging citrus of a candle that had long since burned down. There were letters, too, some written in his hand and some typed, all careful and dangerous. Reading them felt like finding the underside of a painting. Everything familiar shifted into a context that required new interpretations. Marco watched her from the doorway as if he could map her grief into practical steps. He suggested they call a meeting before any formal protests arrived. At the far end of the house, Victor's laugh rose like glass, momentarily struck, and then muffled. The first evening ended with Evelyn walking the cliff path alone, shoes sinking into damp sand, the ocean pressing a constant sound against the night. She folded the brass key into the lining of her coat like a talisman and promised that she would keep the conditions of the will even if the world tried to rewrite the margins. Dialogue in the dining room the next morning began like small waves and built into a storm. There were at least 12 exchanges before the coffee grew cold. Evelyn began, "I will follow the instructions." Victor said, "The will is conditional on mentorship. That is not a requirement." Isabella said, "My father and I have never been people who take an apprenticeship well." Evelyn responded, "This is not about that. This is about the land and those he wanted to protect." Victor's lawyer, Miss Reed, adjusted her glasses and said, "The clause is ambiguous. We may contest it." Marco said, "Julian made the conditions explicit. He left us a key and a sequence he called a plan." Isabella said, "Why me?" Julian leaned in from memory in Evelyn's mind, and she answered, "Because he believed in restitution." Victor laughed and said, "You always took his trifle seriously." Evelyn said, "This is not a trifle." Miss Reed said, "There are technicalities to consider and precedents." Detective Owens, who had arrived to make a courtesy visit and smelled of rain and municipal polish, said, "These are private matters until a complaint is filed." Louise the gardener said, "The land has its own memory and it listens." Henry from the bank, who carried the scent of metal and ledger paper, added, "If there is contestation, the estate will be frozen, and that harms no one and everyone." Isabella stared at Evelyn and said, "Teach me then." Evelyn heard in that challenge both a demand and an offering. The scene smelled of lemon oil on the wood, of coffee gone bitter, of paper dry as bone, and sounded with the scrape of chairs and the distant thud of a gull. The dialogue came rapid and layered with accusation, with care, with tactical positioning. Each line carried movement and small physical acts. Miss Reed tapped the table. Marco rubbed his jaw. Victor blew a smoke ring that was mostly effect. Evelyn felt the sound of her own pulse slow and steady, as if she were choosing which instrument she would play in a rehearsal that had to last months. The laptop revealed more than instructions. It opened a private archive, documents showing land surveys, logs of shipments, a ledger pointing to an account almost empty, and another account with transfers labeled innocuous things that would make any peruser's eyes narrow. Julian had filmed himself with a map pinned to the wall. He traced lines with a finger that trembled at times and spoke of a seam under the eastern bluff and of permits that had been shifted to shell companies. He said, "When men think they own everything, they forget how easy it is to stitch claims into paper and call it truth." Isabella watched the videos with a face that registered shock and then a quick, practical curiosity. Marco, who had been guardian of the estate's practical memory, pointed out details only a man who had walked fields and counted nails could see. Marta the geologist arrived with the smell of wet stone and clarified that the seam Julian spoke of might contain deposits under contract to companies that had no right to be there. She described strata in a language that sounded like music to the ears of anyone who had learned to hear land as process. At least 6 times in that scene, Evelyn caught herself touching the key and thinking of Julian's hand on top of hers in a photograph. The evidence on the laptop created new stakes. Victor's smile lost a note. Isabella's jaw hardened in a way that suggested she had a choice to make that could become the axis of everything she had, personally and legally. The room filled with the tactile sounds of pages turning, the tang of lemon oil mixing with diesel from the cars outside, the sight of maps unrolled across the table, the rough feeling of the map's edge under a thumb, the flicker of the screen making portraits move as if alive. They had found something substantial enough to be worth fighting over and delicate enough to be erased by one well-placed document. The first viral moment arrived here, where the laptop became the voice of Julian after he was gone, and where his request to Evelyn to teach Isabella became both a strategy and a test. Evelyn's backstory could be felt in the way she moved and in the sentences she chose to say. She had grown up in a small coastal town where salt in the air cleaned words of excess. Her father had been a watchmaker and taught her to take things apart to see how they balanced. She had married Julian when she was 28 and was, for a time, thrilled by the whirl. She managed his chaotic impulses with a steady ledger and an ability to name assets where others named adventures. After years of being at his side and sometimes at his margin, she had become fluent in both tenderness and arbitration. In the first of 3 backstory paragraphs, she remembered the way Julian had danced at a charity gala and then left alone to fix a neighbor's fence, gestures that made no public sense and only private coherence. In the second paragraph, she recounted the small betrayals that listed their household towards secrecy, how contracts were signed in evenings over wine glasses, and how sometimes a man who loved unpredictability kept his most careful plans in the pocket of his coat. In the third paragraph, she reflected on the loss that had come to feel like a verb, the work of grieving that she did by cataloging rooms and sorting objects, tasting grief like salt, and learning to set it aside like a preserved thing for later. The backstory totaled near 900 characters and explained why she trusted documentation as much as she trusted memory, and why she could step into the role of teacher with both fear and resolve. It also established her conflict, the central contradiction between a life shaped by order and a husband who delighted in disorder. Victor. Hale's motivations were not simple greed in the cartoon sense. He had been raised to see every inheritance as a potential enterprise. His family had been builders of infrastructure, men who made money in permits and then kept the permits by learning the rules better than anyone else. In 4 paragraphs that gathered to 650 characters, the antagonistic biography sketched a man who believed in systems and in winning them. He resented Julian's charm because charm could bypass regulators, but he also feared Julian's ability to make soft things like art and land into hard assets wrapped in affection. Victor had been in a long escalating commercial rivalry with Julian and had sometimes used legal pressure to gain advantage. He saw Evelyn's attempt to follow the will as a threat to the pattern he had invested in with lawyers and lobbyists. His edge was procedural acumen and a network of people who could turn a loose claim into legal pressure. He was not an animal villain, but a system-made human, someone who believed that rules existed to be interpreted and that interpretation could be weaponized. There were moments of tension that arrived like weather and lasted with the detail of an incision. The first came when a sealed envelope was found under the lining of a bureau and contained a document that made Victor's teeth show. It read like someone who had stolen the rhythm of a company account and written a new melody. The scene described in 2 paragraphs of 550 characters showed Evelyn reading while Isabella leaned in, both smelling paper dust and pipe smoke, hearing the clock in the hall and the faint thump of a truck passing the gate. Evelyn had to decide in that breath whether to reveal the document to the bank or to hold it until she understood its legal teeth. Memory of Julian's last night returned in a flash, and she chose to hide it until they could verify authenticity. The second moment arrived during a storm when the power went out, and a physical safe was found to be empty of the original contracts. The sensory detail was dense. The wind pressed against windows, the smell of rain rose through the house, and the silence between people grew heavy. Evelyn had to face suspicion from her own daughter Sarah, who was at once grieving and pragmatic, and who asked aloud, Did he leave us enough to fight? The third moment of tension came with a confrontation at the county office, where Victor's men filed a motion that threatened to place the property into receivership. The scene concentrated on the metallic smell of the clerk's office, the texture of forms, and the uncomfortable intimacy of waiting rooms. Evelyn stood and spoke, voice steady, memory of Julian's voice in the laptop guiding her words about stewardship and legacy. Each of these moments forced choices that tested her commitment to a promise made aloud and in a ledger. Secondary characters filled the house and the edges of town, and each one did something specific. Marco, estate manager, opened and closed dates, carried ledgers, and knew where every tool had been stored. Luis, the gardener, offered practical knowledge about fences and secret drains, and he discovered a covered hatch near the rose bed. Marta, the geologist, read scans and explained strata and filed an independent sample with a neutral lab. Detective Owens made official notes and advised caution and courtesy. Miss Reed, Victor's lawyer, argued about clause interpretation and sat like a patient referee in the periphery. Henry from the bank introduced options for interim management and offered a custodial solution that would freeze funds while a court decided. Sarah Evelyn, Evelyn's adult daughter, arrived with a suitcase and a blunt question and insisted on transparency even when secrecy seemed useful. Luis and Marco conferred about the scent of the soil and the sound of the drainage pipes in a sequence of lines that gave them both a voice and a strategy. The bunker beneath the east wing turned out to be less cinematic than promised, but more consequential. It was entered through a trapdoor under the pantry and smelled of old metal and oil. The space was windowless and cool, and the concrete echoed when their footsteps came. Maps were unrolled on a scarred table, and a wall of filing cabinets held not only deeds but scanned receipts and correspondences that named companies that did not exist on any corporate registry when cross-referenced. Marta crouched and ran a hand over a crate of core samples and said, "You can tell a seam from the color." Marco pressed his ear to a pipe and pointed to a corrosion pattern that matched the logbooks. The bunker contained a notebook in Julian's hand with entries that read like a ledger in a confessional tone. He had anticipated the kind of claim Victor might make and had left corroborating evidence in multiple envelopes inside a locked chest. The chest required the brass key, and inside were copies of contracts stamped with an old notary seal and a set of photographs showing men signing documents in a room at a dock where payments had been made. The sensory notes in that scene included the clank of the key, the weight of the chest when opened, the dust motes flaring in a single shaft of light from a small ventilation slit, the metallic scent of old staples, the rough edge of a photograph under a thumb, and the taste of dust on the tongue for those who leaned too close. This discovery changed the trajectory of the dispute because it offered documentary proof that could be used in both court and public negotiation. A procedural passage gave clarity to how they would proceed with the legal challenge. The process described in 285 characters explained an interim step. They would file an emergency petition to prevent transfer of assets, submit the ledger and photographic evidence to a certified court expert for authentication, request temporary custodial control of the estate until a full hearing, and propose a mediation with stipulated confidentiality while the forensic analysis proceeded. The language was plain and deliberate so that the list read like a set of levers to be pulled in sequence. It offered a practical path that matched the resources they had and respected the risk of litigation. The alliance between Evelyn and Isabella grew in the modest miles of daily chores and formal lessons. Evelyn taught Isabella about ledgers and land, about when to speak and when to let a document talk. Isabella taught Evelyn how to read the rhetoric of modern contracts, how to see potential traps in phrasing, and where a corporation might hide a clause in an appendix. They practiced dialogues of negotiation at the dining table, with Marco listening and occasionally interjecting details about maintenance that only a man who had worked the estate could offer. The training scenes included 12 to 14 direct exchanges in the main ones, with Isabella asking pointed questions and Evelyn answering with patience and sometimes irritation. The sensory load in these scenes was rich: the scratch of pen on paper, the chalk dust on a map, the smell of lemon oil on hands after cleaning, the creak of a ledger opening, the warmth of tea and mismatched pups, and the sight of sunlight sliding like a ribbon across the long table. Conflict escalated when a local reporter learned of a contested will, and the story became a small public affair. Victor's team leaked versions of the ledger that suggested mismanagement. Evelyn and Isabella decided to present some of the documents publicly and to offer the empty chest and its contents for independent review. They staged a controlled reveal at the county archive, with Marta present to explain geological samples and with Detective Owens there to maintain order. The reveal followed months of private review, and it turned public sentiment. Victor's narrative of an heiress unfit to manage an estate faltered against evidence and against the odd moral pressure of Julian's videos, which appealed to public imagination. He had filmed himself explaining why he hoped his house would be preserved and why certain lands should not be parceled for short-term extraction. The press picked up the conservation angle and shifted some attention away from corporate greed. The confrontation in public involved heated exchanges between Victor and Evelyn and lasted the length of a press conference. The scene included sensory detail of camera shutters, the metallic smell of a soda can crushed and tossed aside, the prickle of a microphone table underfoot, the cool touch of a collar pulled straight, and the taste of the stale coffee provided for press. There were legal skirmishes that involved depositions and affidavits. Marco provided a testimony about Julian's habits and about where certain papers had been kept. Luis provided evidence of a hatch installed beneath the rosebed years before.
Earlier, Marta notarized the core samples, and Henry provided bank statements that traced suspicious transfers. Ms. Reed attempted to challenge the chain of custody of a photograph, but was met by a careful explanation of how items were logged, bagged, and submitted to the neutral lab. The tension deepened when a courier disappeared for a day with an envelope that later turned up on a back shelf in Victor's office, a placement that invited allegation and that forced a formal motion about evidence tampering. Each procedural moment required tactical decisions about going public, about negotiation, and about trust. Evelyn learned how to balance narrative with numbers, how to summon the rhetorical power of a personal story while ensuring documents matched words. The final courtroom scene was staged in a room that felt too small for all the eagerness that had accumulated over months. The proceedings were long and technical. There were at least 14 dialogue exchanges in the key moments between Evelyn, Ms. Reed, Victor, Isabella, and the judge. Witnesses came forward with statements that smelled of stress and of coffee and of too many hours in fluorescent light. Marta explained strata, and a lab technician explained the process of authentication. The judge listened with the patient attention of someone who had seen many conflicts and wanted to parse them cleanly. At a key pivot, Evelyn presented Julian's ledger and the chest's photographs and read aloud a passage from one of his video files. The room fell quiet as Julian's voice filled the space with instruction and with a kind of affection that defied the sterile weight of the law. He told a story about stewardship, about proper use of land, and about the foolishness of short sight. The judge considered the material and ruled in favor of a mediated settlement that preserved the estate under a trust created to honor conservation clauses and to guarantee income for local workers. The ruling did not destroy Victor's financial status, but it prevented him from converting the seam into a short-term profit funnel. The outcome was both victory and compromise and left everyone with both relief and lingering questions. Moments of tension repeated in personal scales as well. Evelyn and her daughter Sarah had a cruel argument in a kitchen that smelled of frying oil and lemon. Sarah accused Evelyn of living in Julian's shadow and demanded to know why she would bind her own life to a dead man's games. Evelyn answered with a list of practicalities and with a memory of the night Julian had told her, If you keep the house, keep it for more than us. The dialogue cut and then healed slowly. Another moment arrived when Isabella received a call from a man insinuating that Victor might retaliate by suing for full ownership. The call sounded like static and a loaded phrase, and Isabella felt for a moment as if her life could be reduced to a clause. She steeled herself and called back, voice calculated.
These moments were focused and lasted like a legal breath, each one shaped by memory and a choice to act. When the dust settled, the epilogue began to fold its pages into the future. 1 month later, Evelyn walked the cliff path with Isabella and Sarah and noticed the land doing what land does, recovering from the small traumas of intrusion and preparation. She had placed the chest back in the study and had a small ceremony to deposit copies of the ledger at the county archive. The community had organized a meeting with local workers, and Marta had begun a plan for minimal impact surveys. The house felt less like a mausoleum and more like a living ledger of responsibility. The moment smelled of cut grass and salt and tasted like the coffee she drank with her daughter every morning. 3 months later, the trust had been formalized. The legal language was dry and full of conditionals, but it did what it needed to do. There were provisions for conservation, for community grants, and for an educational fund that would teach local youth about geology and stewardship. Isabella had begun a practical apprenticeship overseeing maintenance and had started a program inviting young women to learn surveying and contract reading. Her relationship with Evelyn had turned from forced proximity into mutual mentorship. They had learned to trade knowledge like currency. 6 months on, the estate had opened a small studio where Evelyn painted landscapes and where Isabella kept a ledger book that chronicled plantings and erosion control projects. The estate hired a small team, and Marco and Luis kept the place running. Victor had not disappeared. He had negotiated an ongoing royalty that funded a scholarship in his mother's name and had given up an attempt to force a sale. People in town remarked on the unusual settlement, and some said Evelyn had outmaneuvered a predator, while others saw in the result a rare alignment of legal acumen and human will. The final paragraph returned to the device that had begun it, the brass key. Evelyn kept it on a small chain in her drawer and sometimes took it out to feel its weight. The key now opened not only a chest, but a way of thinking about what Julian had left and what she had saved. The house had a new schedule for public tours and a clause that ensured the eastern bluff would remain protected. Isabella had begun to teach a class at the local community college about contract reading for land rights, and Marco had been promoted to steward with a salary that reflected years of loyalty. In a modest closing, she stood on the porch watching the sun go down and felt gratitude like an instrument tuning itself. The legacy had not been a treasure in the sense of a chest of gold, but rather a sequence of choices and documents that could be wielded for care. If you found yourself asking how to balance grief with stewardship, or how to follow the instructions of someone who loved you imperfectly, leave a note in the comments with Abria or Esperia and tell us what you would do. If this story touched you, consider subscribing for more cases where family history meets legal strategy and where secrets become maps for a future we have yet to write.